Thanks so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. This is the second part of a four-part series on the Teacher Data Use Survey. We're glad you could join us. Today we're talking about customization of the Teacher Data Use Survey, and we'll be getting into the details of how this survey can be unique to a district or school that might be using it. As Jennifer said, my name is Stephanie Wilkerson. I am president of Magnolia Consulting. I've also been a team member with REL Appalachia for the past 4 years, and during that time I've had the honor of collaborating with educators and practitioners in Metro Nashville public schools. And that collaboration has focused on creating a culture of data use using a collaborative inquiry approach. And this survey really kind of came out of the need that we heard from the district and the need that we saw also in the field to have an instrument that could measure teacher data use practices kind of at the right level. So what we saw out in the field were instruments that were either so particular to an initiative that it wasn't generalizable. We just couldn't use it in Metro Nashville. It was appropriate for use in Portland, Oregon for what they were doing, but not for us. Or we saw instruments that were so broad that they just weren't comprehensive and that they weren't going to provide useful information to really drive decision-making in districts and in schools. So what's exciting about the Teacher Data Use Survey for us is in its ability to be customized, and so that's the focus of what we're talking about today, and that really strikes the balance between having something that can be very specific and resonate with how the district and schools are using data, but also represent a comprehensive, theoretically based picture of best data use practices. I'm joined today by my partner in crime and fellow co-author, Jeffrey Wayman, who's president of Wayman Services. We also want to acknowledge and thank 3 other co-authors on the Teacher Data Use Survey, one of whom is joining us today, and that's Ellen Mandanot with West Ed. We also have Vincent Cho with Boston College, as well as Jonathan Sapovitz with the University of Pennsylvania. So it's been a fun journey with them, and we're glad that they could join us. As I mentioned, a lot of this work came through the Regional Education Laboratory Appalachia. We are one of 10 RELs throughout the country, serving Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. This is funded and administered through the U.S. Department of Education. And with all the RELs, including REL Appalachia, we provide services through a variety of opportunities and research-based products, and focusing in different areas based on the needs of the region. So, for example, Metro Nashville focuses on building the capacity for effective data use. And that's what brings us here today. While we hope you'll stay focused on what we're presenting, we also would encourage you to get the word out about the Teacher Data Use Survey. It's only been out for 2 weeks. So you can help us by tweeting about this event, sharing what you're hearing, and encouraging your colleagues and people within your networks to join us for the remaining 2 parts of our webinar series. So quickly, we just want to get a feel for, we know some of you have been introducing yourselves in the chat box if you were able to join us earlier, but you're going to see a poll pop up here with 2 questions, just so we know a little bit more about who's joining us today. The first question is about your role. So what role are you representing as you join us today? You'll see another category if we haven't hit on all the ones that would pertain to you. And the second question is about whether or not you've seen the first webinar. So Jennifer will get that poll up, and you'll have the opportunity to enter your responses. And there it is. You should be able to see it now. So what is your role? It looks like on my screen, Jennifer, I'm not seeing different options for that. So if you want to put in the chat box what your role is, if you're a district administrator, if you're a researcher, if you are a school administrator, instructional specialist, you're a member of a research and evaluation department, You can certainly provide that feedback through the chat box if you're unable to do it through the poll questions. And then you have a simple yes, no for whether or not you saw webinar 1. It's okay if you didn't see webinar 1. It's certainly not required. Jeff is going to provide a brief review of webinar 1. And I think we could probably close out the poll, Jennifer. And then also for the subsequent webinars, if you are not able to join us for the 3rd or the 4th, those will be recorded. All of our webinars are recorded, so it's not a requirement to see the former webinars. Okay, we'll wait on our results here. All right. For those who are answering, we had a little hiccup there. Thank you for those of you who are able to introduce yourself through the chat box. It gives us a sense of who we're talking to. It might reflect the nature of your questions later on. And it looks like we did have some folks who were able to join us for the first webinar and some who are new today. So we're glad that you could join us and hope that you'll continue to do so in our following webinars. So as I mentioned, the 3rd webinar is next Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern. We will open it up about 10 minutes early if anybody wants to join us for some informal exchanges. And then we'll focus on best practices in administering the Teacher Data Use Survey and anything that you might want to consider during administration. Also building the survey and online, whether we focus on paper, online, and trade-offs with that. For the 4th webinar on November 4th, we will be talking about communicating results, so looking at, especially with 3 different versions of the survey, how we bring those together and synthesize them. We'll be talking about different tools for being able to synthesize and help districts and schools interpret those results. So that's webinar 4. So goals for today are really to help build your understanding of the different categories that you can use when customizing the teacher data use survey. Also kind of some nuts and bolts of how to do that, how to do the customization. As I said, Jeff will be giving a brief overview of some just key points from the first webinar last Friday. We'll talk about the 4 categories of data that you can include in the customization of the Teacher Data Use Survey, and we'll describe what that looks like. We'll also have an opportunity toward the end of our webinar today where we can have some whole group discussion where you're able to exchange ideas and questions with us as well as each other about the different categories and forms of data that you might consider using for future use of the survey. If you don't have the survey already, there is a link here, and I believe that Jennifer will, there we go, we've got the link posted in the chat box. If you don't have it, when you click on that link, you'll see just the whole suite of tools for the Teacher Data Use Survey, and that includes a PDF of each of the 3 versions of the survey, the one for teachers, one for instructional support staff, and one for administrators. You'll also see our administration guide that will support you in being able to administer the Teacher Data Use Survey. You'll also find some tools for reporting and communicating results, and these are ones that we're going to be featuring on November 4th during our webinar on communicating results. So with that, you'll see an Excel database where you can enter data from all 3 versions, and using that will automatically generate graphic displays and an infographic of your results as well as a narrative word report. So you'll see an additional link on that site that gives a sample dashboard report, which can be generated by using the report template. So all those tools you'll find with that link, and we hope that we encourage you to access and look at all of them, and feel free at any point in time to provide us with your comments and thoughts and questions about any of them. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Jeff Wayman, who's going to begin by just giving a brief review of webinar 1.
As Stephanie said, I'm Jeff Wayman. I am a data use researcher. I've been researching data use for almost 15 years now, first at Johns Hopkins University, then at the University of Texas, and now in my current role as an education consultant, and I focus on data use. As part of that work, I was fortunate to lead the research team that developed this survey. As Stephanie said, that included Vincent Cho, Ellen Mandenack, John Zapovitz, and my co-presenter here, Stephanie Wilkerson. So we've done good work, and I'm glad that you guys are here to hear about it. So the first thing we're going to do is give a brief review of Webinar 1. As Stephanie said, the webinar is archived, or it will be archived. It'll be recorded, and you can hear the whole thing. Not that what I'm not going to say here isn't going to be just stellar and insightful, but you'll get even more stellarness and insightfulness on the recording. In Webinar 1, we talked about how important it was to have teachers on board in using data. I've written in my own research a number of times that data use lives and dies in the principal's office, but one of the big reasons why that's true is that you can't have an effective school-wide or district-wide data initiative without having all your faculty on board. Now, there's this weird thing, though, that we do. We hammer on teachers to use data. We're like, use data, be evidence-driven. But this crazy thing that we do is that we then make decisions about teacher data use based on anecdotal evidence. We very rarely have any hard data on teachers' actual uses of data and what they think and how they're supported for those things. So that's where the TDUS comes in. It can help establish this evidence base that we need. It can help us to actually walk the walk in terms of what we're doing. And it gives school leaders and district leaders some information for learning about teacher attitudes, perceptions, so that they can plan supports and things to help teachers improve their practice. The teacher data use survey itself is comprised of 3 versions. The most obvious version is the one for teachers, as you might guess. We ask teachers about their data use, but we do another thing that we really like, which is we also ask administrators about teacher data use, and we ask instructional support staff, like instructional coaches, about teacher data use. So we aren't just depending on one role. We're getting a triangulated sense of this. Now, it's the same questions for every role. It's just worded differently. So you can see those examples on how we might ask a teacher, are the following forms of data available to you, and we might ask the principal that question in terms of your teachers, or the instructional support staff in terms of the teachers you support. We built this survey based on a conceptual framework. Now, in Webinar 1, we spend a fair amount of time talking about this conceptual framework and the research that backs it up. So I recommend that you go listen to that too. But the quick overview of this is that we conceive of teacher data use as being based on the actions that teachers take with data. And the idea is that that those actions that teachers take with data will produce better knowledge and better practice, and that in turn will produce student learning. So you go from the center, the action, to your right, and you see how it affects student learning. The deal is, though, where the field is failing right now, and where it's failed for the last 15 years, is that they stop at the actions part. So they throw these data at teachers and they say, here, use data, take actions with data. And they fail on these things on the left-hand side. These are the things that support teacher data use. For the TDUS, we measure the actions and we measure the supports for actions. So we measure the center and the left side. There are many other surveys that measure knowledge and practice. There are other surveys that measure student learning. We call those assessments. Those are beyond the scope of this particular survey. For the teacher data use survey, we stuck with what we know, which is data use. In measuring that, we base the TDUS mostly on a bunch of scales, groups of questions that will be summed together to provide a score, and those things measure teacher attitudes towards data. They measure their perceptions of support. We also ask on the TDUS a bunch of questions about practice, about teacher practice. And one of the improvements that we have made on this survey over the survey that it was based on is that prior surveys have asked about practice, but with the general word data. So prior surveys might have said, how often do you talk to a parent about data? Or how often do you use data to adjust your instruction? And one of the things that we like about this is that we ask those questions now about specific forms of data. But here's the deal. If we're going to ask about specific forms of data, those have to be customized. They're dependent on your local context. And that's what this particular webinar is about, is how to choose the data points that you're going to ask about in your survey and how that operates in the survey. So let's talk a little bit about that. We'll talk specifically about the data that we need to have customized in the TDUS. So why was I so excited about customizing this survey? Well, the truth is that if you ask a teacher about things they do based on data, about things from their practice that they do based on data, their first question is going to be, which data are you talking about? Because that answer is different if you're looking at state data than if you're looking at your own tests and quizzes. You ask a teacher, how often do you talk with a student about state data? That's a different question, or that's going to be a different answer than if you say, how often do you talk with a student about local assessments or your tests and quizzes, things like that. Bottom line is, you don't want to ask teachers how they use data generally. You want to ask them how they use this specific form of data, and you want to call that data by name. And so that's what we do in the TDUS. That's what we're going to talk about today. What this does for you is it helps you become clear about what their answers mean. One of the problems with prior surveys was that if you asked them questions about data generically, that you never were quite sure which data they were talking about or thinking about. Now you know. Perhaps the best benefit is it helps teachers be clear with you about what they do. So in doing this, the big question is, which forms of data do we use? Which ones do we put on there? To make sure that we got all the data that we were interested in, our research team decided that we needed to ask about 4 particular categories of data. Those are state data, the most familiar one being state achievement tests, STAR if you're in Texas, FCAT if you're in Florida, things like that. Another category is periodic data, and these are things like benchmark assessments and interim assessments that are given a few times a year to find out where students are. Many of these are commercially available. Some of them are written at the district or school level. There's also a category that we called local data. We wanted you thinking about the types of data that are written in your district or in your school. And we also wanted people to be thinking about personal data, because teachers have had data for years. They've been given tests and quizzes since the beginning of time, and those are forms of personal data, along with a lot of other things that teachers have. And so what we're going to see here in the next section is how we take data points from these 4 categories and get them to the survey in a name that teachers can understand. And this is the part we call customizing the survey. As you customize the survey, you've got 2 blocks of questions that you need to worry about. The first block is questions 1, 2, and 4. That block of questions asks what you might call, you might say that it asks general things about specific data forms, okay? Specifically, question 1 asks about whether certain forms of data are available to teachers. Question 2 asks about how frequently teachers use those forms of data. Question 4 asks how useful those forms of data are to teacher practice. We'll get to question 3 here in a minute. Now, if you've gone to the link and actually downloaded the survey, you'll see that it doesn't specify the specific data forms that you need to put in. In fact, it generically lists the 4 categories of data that we had earlier: the state data, periodic data, local data, and personal data. Let's look and see what that looks like. If you download the survey from the link, this is what you'll get. Now, this is not what you give your teachers, right? All this is telling you that you need to fill in specific forms of data, specific names for state data, or periodic data, or so on. In fact, what you need to do is you need to generate a list of specific data for each one of the categories. So imagine that you are in a school or district and you want to give this survey. Well, maybe you might convene a committee of people who are going to decide what goes on the survey, and you need to sit down and you need to say, okay, what forms of state data do we want to ask about? Well, we got the achievement test, but do we have any other things from the state that we want to ask about? You know, do we have periodic data that we want to ask about, and so on? And as you're engaging in these discussions, you'll have different reasons for choosing these. The 2 main reasons that we've talked about in the survey manual is that you might choose a particular form of data because you know that teachers work with those data. You know, maybe through your anecdotal knowledge that we talked about earlier, you have a sense of what forms of data that teachers are working with, and so you want to ask about those. Another reason might be that you are particularly interested in a form of data. Maybe you're interested in the state test. You know, maybe your committee is talking about this, and you're like, "Gosh, how often do they use the state test? Let's find out." Maybe your committee is talking about getting rid of a particular benchmark assessment. And you can ask about that, and what do they think about it? Is it useful to them? And so you can include that. There are a lot of different reasons why you would include things. But the short version of all of this is that you want to include things that you really want to know about. We've all experienced this where you collect data and you get ready to analyze it, and you're like, oh, I forgot to ask about that. And so you want to avoid that as much as possible. For that reason, we put no limit on the amount of specific forms of data you can ask about in each category. Now, of course, let common sense be your guide, right? If you decide as a school or district, if you're like, well, we have 123 forms of data and we want to know about all of them, then you don't want to ask about all those. You'll have mutiny on your hands, a teacher revolt, dogs and cats living together, and so you want to go ahead and make sure that as you make out this list, that you include everything that you want to ask about. You take advantage of the fact that there's no limit, but you also want to keep in mind that your teachers are busy and they have other things to do besides filling out a survey. On the flip side, you don't have to include forms of data for a particular category. In fact, when we piloted this survey in Metro Nashville, I can't remember what form of data or what category of data it was, but they didn't have any in that particular category. You know, maybe it was periodic data or something. Okay, we don't have any, or if it's an instance where we just aren't interested about data in this category, we don't include it. Do, however, use the same list for all the questions. So in your committee meeting, you generate the list of data from these 4 categories that you are interested in, and then you use that list of data for questions 1, 2, and 4. You want to ask those about the same forms of data. So let's look at some examples for this. We made up a district in Arizona. Arizona was chosen because it's one of the 50 states. There wasn't anything special about Arizona, but we imagined a committee of people in a district in Arizona sitting there in their meetings, as we talked about, and we imagined that they said, okay, what state data do we want to include? Well, Arizona's test is the AZ merit, so they want to include that, and they didn't have anything else. We imagined that this district also had a commercially available assessment that helped them understand how students were doing in preparation for the state test. and so give them an idea of who might be in good shape and who might be in trouble. And actually, there exists a number of those. We happen to write down acuity. Acuity is one of these that helps educators know how their students are going to do on the state test. So imagine that they included that. Local data. Imagine also that this district gives 3 benchmark assessments that they write themselves. And they are ones where maybe the district says, okay, acuity tells us some stuff, but we want to know some other things specifically. So we wrote our own. Commonly, these things are called in districts the beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. The abbreviated BOI, MOI, and EOI. The EOI was always a little bit troublesome. It makes you think of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. But those would be on their list. Finally, they chose 2 things from personal data, end-of-unit tests and homework. So imagine that that was the list that they came up with. Let's look on the next slide and see what that looks like in the survey itself. Notice here that this is the same thing you saw a few slides earlier, where the following data forms were available to you. I'm going to run back there real quickly. See that? Are the following forms of data available to you? We just had state data, periodic data, local data, personal data, and other. That's on the part that's downloaded. What you actually give your teachers and what this district would have given their teachers is this. So the big thing is teachers, the people that take the survey do not know whether you are thinking about state data or periodic data, those things. They don't know about the categories. All they get is a list of data that they know what this means. Okay, you have used names. When you put these in there, you've used names that teachers will know. Teachers are like, oh yeah, I do have access to the boy or my homework or whatever. So that's what question 1 looks like there. Question 2 looks very similar. A couple of points to make here. Question 1 asked first if you have these data available to you. Because if you don't have them available to you, then the rest of the questions about it are moot. Question 2 asks now how frequently you use these. Notice that it's the same list. That's one big point. It's the same list there. You have to keep that list the same. Notice also that question 3 has now appeared. We've been talking about questions 1, 2, and 4. Question 3 is an option for them to write in something that you didn't ask. And you need to give them that option for a few reasons. One is they need to know that they have a voice in this and that their voice is being heard. And so you need to have them have an option to say, well, I use this form of data. Here's the second part. This is a really important feedback loop that you need to establish. Yeah, you ask about the questions or about the data that you're interested in, but you want to leave open the idea that there may be some uses out there or some forms of data that you didn't think about. And so you want them to be able to tell you that. You want to be able to listen. So that is what question 2 looks like. Question 3 is the other option. Question 4 looks exactly the same because, again, we're using the exact same list, but now we're asking about how useful these are. So we've asked, do you have these data available to you? How often do you use them? And now how useful are they? And from these questions, 1, 2, and 4, we get a really good picture about how teachers think and feel about these data. 6 through 9 is the second block of questions that you need to worry about. 6 through 9 ask about specific practical uses of data. While 1, 2, and 4 enabled kind of general questions, 6 through 9 allows you to go a little deeper and ask about specific problems of practice. And in fact, we identified 8 areas of practice that we wanted to ask about. Things like the examples that I gave before, like how often do you use data to meet with another teacher, or how often do you use a specific form of data to adjust your practice, things like that. Here's the deal, though. So we saw back here in these other slides, what are there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 or 9 different types of data. You do not want to ask 8 questions about 8 forms of data. So you don't want to go through and ask, for the AZ merit, do you do this, 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 and this? And for every other one, do you do this, 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 and this? Again, complete mutiny will result if you do that. You can't. You have to be respectful of their time and their stamina on this. So as we drill deeper into practice, we ask about one specific form of data from each category. So back in your room now, in your hypothetical district with your hypothetical committee, you have to decide from each one of these categories one form of data that you want to ask about. The state data form that you choose goes on question 6. The one form of periodic data that you choose goes on question 7. The one form of local data you choose goes on question 8. And the one form of personal data you choose goes on question 9. Here's, we're going to do an example here, again, from Arizona. So as you might guess, they had only one form of state data and one form of periodic data, so they didn't really have a choice to make there. They're going to put the AZ merit on there and the acuity assessment on there. For the local data, they had 3 of them. They had the BOI, MOI, and EOI, and they chose the EOI in our hypothetical example because they had some anecdotal evidence that suggested that teachers found more value in that. For personal data, they chose end-of-unit tests because they know that these are weighted more heavily for quarterly grades. So I'll stress again that you choose these data, you make these decisions based on the things that you want to know about your school or district, based on the directions that you want to go with your school or district, things that you want to do. You want to think about these in terms of improvement. What things do we really need answers to? And you put those on the survey. So what does it look like? Well, here's what question 6 looks like. So it asks specifically about AZ merit. In a typical school year, because state tests are used in terms of a year typically, how often do you do these things? And these are the 8 questions, or 8 forms of practice that we're talking about. How often you use AZ merit to identify instructional content, to tailor instruction, develop recommendations for additional instructional support, and so on, all the way down to meet with another teacher about AZ merit. So that's what it looks like for question 6. Questions 7, 8, and 9 look exactly the same. What you notice here is that the form of data has changed. So question 7 now is asking about acuity. And we haven't listed them all, but that also has A through whatever it was, G or H there. Question 8 now is asking about the EOI, A through H, whatever it came out to be. Question 9 is about personal data. So anyway, that's what these look like for the specific forms of data, specific forms of practice. And after seeing these, you can imagine now why we don't want to ask this about every list or everything that we had on that previous list of data. It would just be too long. So let's look back over what we've talked about so far. Questions 1, 2, and 4 ask more general questions, but again, they're about specific forms of data, right? We have named those data, and we're asking people, how do you feel about these? You might call this kind of the kitchen sink thing. This is where you put in all the forms of data that you're interested in. Questions 6 through 9 ask about practice, specific practice with data. They're more detailed, and so we don't want the kitchen sink on that. What we want on that is one specific form of data from each category. Narrow it down to a few things that you're really interested in and ask detailed questions about those. As you heard, if you heard webinar 1, then the rest of the TDUS asks about supports and attitudes and so on, and so it's fine to ask about data generally in the rest of the TDUS for those. So at this point, I am going to ask for questions. Does anybody have questions that they would like to ask us? You can, if you do, please enter them into, it says into the polling panel. I'm thinking maybe the chat works. Oh, no, I'm sorry, down where it says polling. I don't know, Stephanie or Jennifer can tell us more about that. I'm just the help.
Okay, yes. If you have questions for Jeff and Stephanie, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A panel. They are, the panel is located on the right-hand side near your chat and your polling panel. While we're waiting for some other questions to be entered, I have a few here already. The first one is, when choosing data forms to include for questions 1, 2, and 4, how do you know which data forms teachers care about?
That's a good question, because this is kind of an instance of itself, right? I mean, this is a little bit of a catch-22. You're asking, how do you know which ones teachers care about? And the only way you'd really know that is if you had already given the survey. So that's an easy answer for the second time you give the survey. The first time, I would say that you do have to rely on your anecdotal data. Do your reconnaissance on this. If you aren't sure, go ask people. I mean, your committee that you have that's creating this survey undoubtedly knows a lot of teachers. Ask a handful of teachers in each school. Ask some principals. Just go ask quick questions, and you'll get a sense of what sorts of things you need to include. Then whenever you give the survey, maybe you'll get some extra information, especially from the other category, that might help you with that too.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what if I'm working with a district only interested in the state test and not other forms of data? Can the survey be used to measure only one data form?
Say that again, please.
The question is, what if I'm working with a district only interested in the state test and not other forms of data? Can the survey be used to measure only one data form?
Right. I've worked with those districts before. we care about performance on the state test. Steph, I guess you can chime in here too if you want to. I guess it could, in a literal sense. Yeah, you could just put in one form there, but I would caution you. I would worry about that if I just saw one form. As I said before, we're trying to do these surveys in the service of school improvement, and the state test is one educational outcome, and there are many other things that go into student achievement. There are many other things that support student achievement, and I guess the best I can tell you there is if you're working in a district like that, that's worth putting up a fight over and seeing if you can say, no, we want a more triangulated picture of the data that the teachers are using. Steph, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that focusing on only one form of data kind of gives you a very narrow and targeted picture of data use and not a comprehensive one. And if you're already going to be asking teachers, instructional support staff, and administrators to take the time to complete this survey, it's really not that much more of a burden to include a couple additional forms that may give you some surprising information and a better insight as to how data are being used in the district in a way that's more comprehensive.
Yeah, it'd be pretty lame to ask just about one anyway, so don't be lame.
Okay, great. Words of advice, don't be late. The next and the last question that I have right now is, what about including behavior on the attendance data in the survey? Where might those data fit?
Behavior data? Like?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see, if you have, there's a category of data that we didn't include there. That may be important. There are things like behavioral data, attendance suspension, demographic data. There's also attitudinal things. There's some of the more socio-emotional stuff. And while we don't have a category for those, I'd say fit them in somewhere. If those are interesting to you, plug them in somewhere. Don't forget that the list that your participants see doesn't have anything to do with these categories, so you can mess around with those some. The bigger form of our guidance is think about the categories of data that you want data from. Make a list of those, and when you get down to asking questions about practice, choose one from each specific category. And if, you know, my sense is that there might be fewer cases where you want to ask teachers questions about practice based on some of these behavioral or socio-emotional forms of data. But if that's useful in your district, then ask them. I don't know, was that a good answer?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Hopefully that made sense to all the participants. And right now, unless there are any other questions, I believe we are ready to go on to the next portion.
Anybody else have any questions? I know we're up against time here, but we want to make sure you get all these answered if you have them. All right, let's roll on then. So the next part, what we want to do with this next one is we want to engage you all in a discussion about this. So you've been sitting here listening to the sorts of things that you would put on a survey. Some of you are from districts. I know many of you aren't, but undoubtedly you've been thinking about the types of things that might go on a survey. So we want to engage in three little discussions here. We want you to share with each other, us too, but we want you guys to have a chance to collaborate and talk with each other about things that you've been thinking about so far. So we're going to have three polls, which actually I guess these are going to go, you're going to type your answers into the chat pod, not the polling part there. But we want you to share with each other the forms of data that you would choose if you are in a district, what forms of data are interesting to you, or if you're a researcher, what forms of data are interesting to the district you serve, or just if you're somebody who thinks about this a lot, what popped into your head here when I was talking about data forms? Name those things for us, just like you would for teachers. So the other things we're going to do, so we'll start out with the data forms. The other things we'll do is we'll then move on to say, what do you think you know about these data forms, and then what do you want to learn from these data forms? So the first one, we want you to say, what data forms have you been thinking about? Be specific about the names and say what category they're from. So if you have a local assessment that you give, write down the name of that local assessment and then the category that it comes from. Now, if you're not with a school or district, don't let this stop you. Don't just sit there and watch everybody else. You've worked with districts before. You've thought about this. You've read about districts. Tell us what you've been thinking. So we'll give you guys a couple of seconds to type stuff in.
And just as a reminder, when you enter information into the chat field, please make sure the Send To menu, which is right below the chat rolling log, is set to all attendees or all participants so that everyone will have the benefit of reading the information that you're entering.
Chris, thanks for that about personal data. You're teaching a class on teacher assessment. Type in for us, please, what forms of personal data are you thinking about? You thinking about tests, about quizzes, portfolios, teacher observations? Tell us more about that. What might you want to see put on a survey, please? I'll follow up on that just a little bit. I'm glad that Chris is thinking about those things, and I hope everybody else is too. One of the things that I have kind of ground my teeth over for the last few years is this notion that data is new. You go watch teachers in practice, and they've been using this stuff for a long time. They have their own set of data that they've been using. We're trying to help them use it more efficiently and maybe add new forms of data to that. But that is a different thing than replacing everything they've been doing. And so I'm glad that Chris is asking about that. Chris is thinking about particularly tests and quizzes. There's a good one. Chris is interested in their use of effective questions for evaluation of continued use of an assessment. So that's excellent. And unless Steph or Jennifer has something to say, then I say we move on to the next slide. You good with that?
Yes, that sounds good. Mm-hmm.
Here we go. Okay, so here's the thing. If I were running this in a district, this is the way we would go through these. We'd brainstorm a list of data, and then we'd say, okay, now that we have this list of data, what do we think we already know about this? This list of data. What do we think we know about how teachers are using these data? What do we think they know about what they think are useful in these data? And so I would encourage my committee to brainstorm this stuff, to know that we don't come at this with a blank slate. It's not like we don't know anything about this. So let's surface all of our present knowledge and our present assumptions, and let's write it down. So that's what I'm going to ask the group of you all to do. Think about forms of data that you think are being used in schools and districts now. What do you think you know about these? What do you think you know about how they're used and what teachers think of them?
I'd also be curious to hear for anyone, coming at this from a research or evaluation perspective, kind of in your work, do you have hypotheses that you're testing for which you might use this survey, but about state or periodic, local, or personal data? Does your work focus particularly on one of those categories versus another? Are there certain things you feel like you already know about it, or how the survey might support generating new information about use around a particular category?
Yeah, that's good. And in fact, while we're doing this, somebody may be typing now. I don't think I get to see when somebody's typing, but while you're doing that, I'm going to also forward the next slide with what do you want to learn about these data forms. So respond to either of these questions. What do you think you know about them, and what do you want to learn about them? The sorts of things. Stephanie's comment hit on both of those. And these are the sorts of things I would be asking a committee to think about as they constructed this survey. What do we want to know? So if you could comment on either of those, what you think you know about them and what you want to know about them, that would be helpful.
Aaron, I think you raise an excellent point about the timing of when state assessments are administered and also when those data are available for teachers to use. We grappled with this during the development of items, our item bank, which would be that focuses specifically on questions related to the state test. And in our pilot in Metro Nashville, we also found that, they're just going to use those maybe at the end of the year. They're going to administer them. Those data become available at the end of the year, and perhaps teachers are using that to help identify grouping of students for differentiated instruction, but then beyond that, the rest of the year, that state test is not being used and they have others in their place. So I think you bring up a really good point on timing and how we frame the response options to question about this state assessment definitely took that into account because it would not be used as frequently as other forms of data.
Yeah, that's true. Years ago, so the TDUS is actually based on a survey that Vincent Cho and Shanna Shaw and I had worked with called the Survey of Educator Data Use. And as we were going through answers from that survey one time, I remember we were talking about when teachers use data. And I remember Vincent saying, well, it kind of depends on when you catch them, right? You know, that their answers might be different about the state test if you catch them in August than if you do in January or something. And so the discussion that Aaron and Stephanie just had is really does speak to that point. We tried to make a survey that where you could capture that, and so we think we have, but it's a really, really important thing to think about. So I don't see any other comments coming in, and I'm looking at the time, and I think it is probably time to move off of this and head to our next stop. So I'm going to pass the ball to Stephanie. I think I'm saying that both figuratively and literally, because on this software, you actually have to pass the ball to somebody else, and it's not happening.
Success.
Wait, it just happened.
No worries, no worries. We've got it. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us in the discussion of customization. It's probably a topic that when you're in the actual construction of the survey, some of these things will be more prominent in your mind about that selection process and all the different things that you would consider. Along those lines, next week, next Friday, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, that's October 28th, we'll be delving into more detail about the administration of the survey. So we'll focus a little bit on the guide. So far, we've just been talking about the survey itself. We will give you a brief introduction into the guide and what it includes. We'll talk a little bit about choosing between online or paper and pencil format, and the trade-offs between those, also some of the things around skip logic for online administration. So for example, if you recall, our first question on the survey is about whether or not forms of data are available to you. And if you answer no when you are using online, you can have skip logic, so you don't see following questions. So teachers are saying, wait a minute, I said this wasn't available to me. Why am I now being asked about how often I use it and how useful is it? So we'll talk a little bit about that aspect of administering the survey. We'll talk about identifying survey recipients and considerations for that. Also, the survey administration time frame, the issue of timing was brought up today with state test results, so that's something that we also consider about when to administer the teacher surveys based on when we think teachers are using some of the data that we want to focus on in the survey. We'll talk about strategies for promoting the survey and increasing response rates. And we'll also, the last portion of next week, we'll talk about potential analyses that could be run for the survey and why we would encourage you to join and any of your colleagues in your network who are considering using the survey to join for that one is because this isn't just one version. We have 3 versions of the survey. So we're triangulating data and, you know, we'll begin to address next week and then continue into the following week, the process of synthesizing, making sense, presenting, and reporting information from the 3 versions to enhance utility of findings. So we hope you will join us and encourage your colleagues to join us next week on our session about administration. So we wouldn't be walking the talk if we didn't collect data on our walking the talk on data use. If we didn't collect data and your feedback from our webinar today. One of the things we asked for feedback last week using the stakeholder feedback survey, and we had the opportunity to review that feedback and make changes. One of the things we heard is that folks want the opportunity to be more interactive and to have informal dialogue. So we've already made changes. So opening up the webinar early so that people could introduce themselves. So please provide us your feedback on how we might be able to make further tweaks and modifications in our following 2 webinars. When you close out of WebEx, you'll see a pop-up that will take you to the stakeholder feedback survey. You might also get a pop-up to provide feedback for WebEx. That's not anything that we're requiring. That's just something that happens with WebEx itself. But we really want to hear from you and value your feedback if you would take just a couple of minutes to provide that on the survey when we close. So meanwhile, at any point in time, feel free to reach out to Jeff or I about any questions that you might have, feedback on the survey. We'd love to hear if you're jumping in and using it. We'd love to know more about that. So please keep this in your network and in your loop and know that you can ask questions at any time whatsoever.
Yeah, I'll second that. Also, we like to talk about this stuff. We want to be helpful. You know, we did this for a reason so people could use it. So shoot us an email, tweet at us, hit us up on Facebook. We're always happy to talk about this. Be any help we can.
All right. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. We hope you all have a wonderful Friday and a fantastic weekend, and we certainly hope to see you back here next Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you so much. Have a great day.